Late one evening in a quiet suburban neighborhood, flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. The sound of police radios crackling and hurried voices filled the air as officers stood outside a parked black SUV. Inside the vehicle sat a well-dressed woman, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her breath unsteady. She had done nothing wrong. She knew that. But the officers surrounding her car had a different story in mind. It had started as a routine drive home from dinner. The woman, the wife, the high-ranking police commissioner, had just pulled into a gas station when a patrol car pulled up behind her, lights flashing. Confused, she rolled down her window, expecting a simple misunderstanding. Instead, she was ordered out of the car, no explanation, no courtesy, just firm commands and skeptical stares. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," one officer said, his hand resting near his holster. "Is there a problem?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Step out now," the officer repeated, his tone sharp. Heart pounding, she did as she was told. She watched as the officers exchanged glances, then one of them began searching her car without asking permission. Her mind raced. What was happening? Why were they treating her like this? She reached for her phone to call her husband, but before she could dial, an officer snatched it from her hands. "You can call someone later," he muttered. The woman clenched her jaw, anger bubbling under her fear. She knew her rights. But standing in that moment, surrounded, powerless, what could she do? Then, the sound of screeching tires. A dark sedan pulled up fast, stopping just feet from the scene. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped a man with an unmistakable presence. Her husband, the police commissioner himself. The officers turned, their postures shifting immediately. Recognition flickered across their faces. The situation had just taken a dramatic turn. The commissioner's voice was calm but ice-cold. "What the hell is going on here?" Silence. The officers looked at one another, suddenly unsure. The woman's heart pounded. Justice was standing right in front of them, but would it come swiftly, or would things get even worse? Because what happened next would leave everyone speechless. The officers stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They knew exactly who the man standing before them was. Commissioner Daniels, a name that carried power, respect, and authority. But tonight, none of that mattered, not to the officers who had already crossed a dangerous line. The woman, still shaken, took a step toward her husband, but one of the officers instinctively put a hand up, as if blocking her from moving. That one small action made the commissioner's expression darken. He wasn't just here as a husband, he was here as someone demanding answers. "Who gave the order to search this car?" Daniel's voice was measured, but his eyes were locked onto the nearest officer, the one who had taken his wife's phone. The officer hesitated, glancing toward his partner. "Sir, we were just following protocol. There was a report of a vehicle matching this description involved in suspicious activity." Daniels narrowed his eyes. Suspicious activity. He let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" The silence that followed was deafening. The officers had no good response. They had stopped a woman at random, treated her like a suspect, and now they were staring at the consequences of their actions. His wife finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with quiet anger. "They pulled me over without reason, told me to get out, searched my car, took my phone." She looked directly at the officer in charge, and they never once explained why. One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't spoken the entire time, but now he looked at his colleagues with uncertainty. Maybe he had realized this wasn't right. Maybe he had realized it was never right to treat someone this way, no matter who they were. Daniels took a step closer, his presence alone making the officers tense. "You had no warrant, no probable cause, nothing but an excuse. Do you think this is how we do things?" The lead officer, the one who had been the most aggressive, straightened his posture. He seemed to be searching for a way out of this. "Sir, we were just doing our job." Daniels let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Your job. His voice turned sharp. Is your job harassing innocent people? Is your job overstepping the law you swore to uphold? The air grew heavier. The younger officer lowered his gaze. The one in charge looked away. No one had an answer, because deep down, they all knew there was no justification for what they had done. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because in a situation like this, mistakes had consequences. And tonight, someone was going to have to answer for them. The night air was thick with tension, the flashing lights casting shadows on the pavement. Commissioner Daniels stood his ground, his jaw tight as he waited for someone, anyone, to take responsibility. But the officers avoided his stare, shifting uncomfortably as the weight of their actions became undeniable. His wife, still standing by the car, folded her arms. If I weren't who I am, would I still be standing here? Or would I be sitting in the back of that squad car for no reason at all? Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. The younger officer, the one who had looked away moments before, finally spoke. His voice was uncertain, but edged with something that almost sounded like guilt. Sir, we thought we had the right vehicle. We didn't mean. He stopped himself, realizing there was no excuse that would make this situation better. Daniels turned his attention to him. And at what point did you realize this was a mistake? His tone was controlled, but the frustration was evident. Before or after you searched a car without consent? Before or after you took her phone? The officer swallowed hard, and his superior, the one who had been leading this disaster, quickly cut in. Commissioner, let's not make this into something it isn't. Daniel's eyes darkened. Oh, I think we both know exactly what this is. The lead officer squared his shoulders, as if trying to regain control of the situation. We were acting on a report. We had reason to believe. Reason? Daniels interrupted, his voice dangerously low. Or assumptions? The officer hesitated. Daniels took a slow step forward. Because there is a difference. And that difference is what separates real police work from reckless mistakes. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. And tonight, this was reckless. A tense silence stretched between them. The younger officer lowered his head again, and for a brief second, Daniels saw something familiar in his face: regret, uncertainty, a realization that this wasn't what he signed up for. But the lead officer wasn't backing down. His pride was at stake now. We were following standard procedure. Daniels let out a humorless chuckle. Standard procedure. His eyes flicked to his wife, who was still standing there, still waiting for someone to acknowledge what had happened. He turned back to the officer. Tell me, what part of standard procedure allows you to search a vehicle without probable cause? What part lets you take someone's phone without permission? The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, but he had no answer. Daniels shook his head. You don't even understand the damage you've done, do you? He glanced at the young officer, then back at the lead. And the worst part, this isn't just about my wife. It's about every person you've done this to before her. The words landed heavily. The younger officer shifted again, looking like he wanted to say something. But the lead officer's expression remained stiff, unreadable. Daniels stepped back, glancing at his wife. She met his gaze, her eyes still filled with quiet anger, but also something else, an unspoken question. What happens next? Because this wasn't over, not even close. A long, tense silence filled the air. The flashing lights from the patrol cars continued to cast sharp shadows across the pavement, but no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of the moment was suffocating. Commissioner Daniels stood with his hands at his sides, but his presence alone carried enough authority to make the officers shift uneasily. His wife hadn't moved from where she stood near the car. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was furious. Her hands were clenched into fists, her breathing slow and controlled. This wasn't just about the officer's mistake. It was about something bigger, something that had been happening for too long. And tonight, they had chosen the wrong person to treat this way. The lead officer, still unwilling to back down, straightened his posture and met Daniel's gaze. "Sir, with all due respect, you weren't here. You don't know how it looked from our perspective." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I know exactly how it looked," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "It looked like officers using their badge as an excuse to overstep. It looked like a situation that never should have happened." The younger officer swallowed hard, shifting his weight as if he wanted to speak, but he hesitated. His fingers twitched at his sides, his conscience battling with his loyalty to the badge. He had followed orders, but orders didn't feel like enough of a reason anymore. "Officer, would you have admitted your mistake, or would you have pushed it further?" No one answered. The silence said everything. Daniels exhaled sharply, glancing between the officers. "You see, that's the real problem. It's not just about this one moment. It's about what happens when no one is watching, when no one is here to stop it." A bead of sweat rolled down the lead officer's temple. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the sound of another car approaching filled the air. The headlights were blinding as the vehicle pulled up fast. The moment the tires screeched to a halt, another set of doors flew open. More officers, but these weren't just regular patrolmen. These were higher-ranking officials, people who had clearly been called in after the situation had escalated beyond what anyone expected. One of them, a captain, stepped forward. His sharp eyes took in the scene instantly, his jaw tightening as he spotted the commissioner standing in front of his wife. His gaze then flickered to the lead officer. A flicker of realization crossed his face. This was bad. "Commissioner," the captain said, his voice careful. "I was just briefed on the situation." He glanced at the lead officer, then back at Daniels. "We need to talk." Daniels didn't move. He studied the man in front of him, then took a slow breath. "Oh, we'll talk," he said quietly. "But first, I want to hear exactly how your officers plan to explain what happened tonight." The lead officer stiffened. The younger officer visibly tensed. The entire scene felt like a house of cards, moments away from collapsing. The captain sighed, glancing around, aware of just how serious this had become. "Let's take this somewhere private," he said, his tone even. Daniels let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh no, not this time. Not behind closed doors." He gestured around them. "Because if it weren't for me showing up, this would have ended very differently. So now, we deal with it right here." The captain's jaw tightened. He glanced at the other officers, then back at Daniels. "You really want to do this here?" Daniel's expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "I don't want to. I have to." The air grew heavier. No one dared to move. The moment of truth had arrived, and what happened next would change everything. The air was thick with tension, and every second felt heavier than the last. Commissioner Daniels stood firm, his eyes locked onto the captain, waiting. The younger officer looked uneasy, glancing between his superior and the commissioner, as if he already knew things were about to take a sharp turn. The lead officer, however, held his ground, his face unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something flickering just beneath his wife sucked in a breath. The captain turned sharply toward the lead officer. "Is this true?" His voice was no longer neutral, it was sharp, demanding. The lead officer clenched his jaw, eyes flicking between Daniels, the captain, and the younger officer who had just exposed everything. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Daniels exhaled slowly, his anger now colder, sharper. "So you knew, and you did it anyway." The lead officer's expression flickered, but only for a second. He squared his shoulders. "We had other concerns." Daniels let out a slow, measured laugh, shaking his head. "Other concerns?" His eyes darkened. "You mean power. You mean control." The street was dead silent. The young officer looked down, clearly realizing the full weight of what he had just done. The captain's jaw tightened. He turned to the lead officer. "We'll talk inside." But Daniels shook his head. "No, we finished this here." Because now this wasn't just about his wife. This was about something much bigger. And the truth, no matter how much it hurt, was finally coming to light. The weight of the younger officer's confession hung thick in the air. The captain's expression was unreadable, but the sharpness in his gaze made it clear. This had gone too far. The lead officer stood rigid, his face a mask of control, but there was something in his stance now, something uneasy. Commissioner Daniels took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had seen corruption before, had fought against it his entire career. But this was different. This wasn't some distant case buried in paperwork. This was his wife, his family, his life. The captain's voice cut through the tension. "Officer Grant," he said, addressing the younger cop, "are you willing to put that statement in writing?" Grant hesitated, glancing at the lead officer. For a moment, it looked like he was second-guessing everything, but then he straightened his back. "Yes, sir." The lead officer's eyes flashed. "Watch yourself," he muttered under his breath, just low enough that only Grant and Daniels could hear. A heavy silence followed her words. The lead officer's face drained of color, his confidence now completely shattered. The other officers stood motionless, realizing there was nothing left to defend. This wasn't just an accusation. It was a fact, recorded, undeniable. The weight of accountability had finally caught up. The captain gave a small nod, his voice steady. "Understood. We'll process everything properly." He turned to the lead officer. "Hand over your badge and weapon." For a moment, the officer didn't move, his jaw tightening as if he wanted to fight back. But there was no way out now. With a clenched fist, he reached for his belt, unhooking his badge and radio, placing them in the captain's outstretched hand. The gun followed a moment later. Daniels watched, his expression unreadable. He had fought battles like this before, but this one felt different. This one was personal. He turned to his wife, her eyes still burning with quiet determination. She had stood her ground. She had refused to be silenced. And now she was the reason justice was being served. The younger officer, Grant, took a deep breath and stepped back, as if feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. He had done the right thing, and though it had come at a cost, it was a choice he could live with. As the lead officer was escorted away, Daniels finally turned to his wife. "Are you okay?" She nodded, her fingers still gripping her phone tightly. "I am now." The flashing lights of the patrol cars still painted the street in streaks of red and blue, but the energy had shifted. The chaos was settling. The truth had won. Daniels exhaled, wrapping an arm around his wife. As they walked toward their car, the captain called out, "Commissioner, I'll make sure this is handled properly." Daniels paused, then nodded. "See that it is." They got into the car, the tension still lingering, but the battle was over. His wife stayed out the window for a moment before looking at him. "It shouldn't have taken you showing up to fix this." He met her gaze, knowing she was right. "It won't next time," he said. And with that, they drove away, leaving behind the flashing lights and the echoes of a night that had changed everything.